FTP and Internet News. In this nugget, we're going to wrap up our discussion of Internet services by talking about FTP, the File Transfer Protocol, and Internet News. We'll go through the FTP client programs you can use, and also talk about how to set up an FTP server on your machine. And then we'll take the remaining time and talk a little bit about network news and the client and server software that's available for network news. All right, let's get to work. Well, we're going to start out this nugget by talking about FTP, or the File Transfer Protocol. All right, we'll start by talking about some FTP clients, and the first one we're going to learn is just the FTP command that you type at the command line, and this is a completely text-based FTP client. Okay, but it's good to know this client because it's so ubiquitous. It's on all versions of Linux and Unix out there. There's even a basic FTP client just like the one that we're going to see today that's on Windows machines, okay, with basically the same set of commands. So it's good to learn this because it is so ubiquitous, and if you need to use FTP on any machine that you sit down in front of, this is probably going to help you out more than knowing some graphical one. We'll also look at the GNOME FTP program, which is a graphical client, and we'll look at how to use that. And you can drag and drop files and things, and it makes life a little bit easier. And some people like graphical clients, which is why we'll look at it. But definitely we're going to focus on this one because it is so ubiquitous. And then there are a variety of servers. So if you want to set up an FTP server on your machine, you have all sorts of choices. One of them is the VSFTPD server, the Very Secure File Transfer Protocol daemon. There's Woo FTPD, which is developed at Washington University in St. Louis, and there's Pro FTPD. Okay, Woo FTPD is actually the one that's shipped with Red Hat Linux 8.0 as the default FTP client. Since Red Hat Linux 8.0, Red Hat has switched over to make VSFTP the default FTP server. Okay, so that's the one that we're going to focus on in this nugget so that we're sort of as up to date as we can be. The config files for VSFTPD are /etc vsftpd.conf, and then there's also a file /etc vsftpd.userlist. Now the configuration file, a setting in there is going to dictate how this file is used, and we'll talk about that when we go out to the Linux screen. Okay, so let's go out to the Linux screen, let's look at some clients, and then we'll look at how to set up a VSFTPD server using VSFTPD. Okay, so let's start by looking at the FTP client that you get to just by typing FTP at the command line. Now you can either type here FTP followed by a particular FTP site that you want to get into, or you can just type FTP by itself, and then you're at the command line for the FTP program. Okay, so here I can start typing FTP commands like open, and I can say open ftp.redhat.com, for instance. Okay, oh, great. So there's too many connected users. Please try again later. This is going to be a useful demonstration. Let me just try this again right now. Okay, good. So it wasn't that many, too many connected users. It wasn't too far over the limit. Okay, so now what they're asking for is they're asking for my username. Okay, now this server is not set up to actually log me in as a user like Perry or something. What it's set up to do is log me in anonymously. Alright, so here what you should type at this particular server is anonymous, okay, or if you don't feel like typing anonymous, you can just type FTP. Okay, so that's something. Now what you do here is you say please specify the password. So historically you would type in your email address as the password, but nobody checks the email address to determine if it's a valid email address or if it's in the right form or if it has an @ sign in it or whatever. You could probably just type enter here and you would get in. Let me just try it and see if it, yeah, see, so I just got in by just typing enter for the password. So I didn't even put a password in. There's no checking of those passwords done, and even if I did some checking, it would still be silly because somebody could type in like perry@junk.com or something, right? And it would be a real pain to verify all these email addresses that people typed in. Okay, so the login's successful. It says have fun, and now what we can do is we can start typing FTP commands to determine start typing FTP commands to carry out our activities. Okay, notice here it says using binary mode to transfer files, so it's already in binary mode. Alright, binary mode is what you need to be in to transfer binary files. Okay, if you're just transferring plain text files, you can be in text mode. Let's just look at some of the commands that you can type in the FTP program here. ls works, and that's doing a listing of the remote FTP server. You can see we're listing a directory called pub, and it's owned by the FTP user and the FTP group. We'll talk a little bit more about the FTP user when we talk about setting up a FTP server, but for right now, just know that that's who owns the pub directory. And you can see the pub directory is readable by everybody. So I can just go into the pub directory with a cd command, okay, do another listing, and now I see a few other directories in here, contrib, Red Hat, and up to date. Okay, again, all of these directories are owned by the FTP user. All right, so let's just look at the help command, and you can see all the different commands that you can type from the FTP prompt. Some of the more important ones are ASCII. That turns the mode into text mode or ASCII mode, so you can transfer text files. Binary, you need to be in that mode to transfer binary files like executables and things like that. Okay. Then there's the get command, which you use to get a file from the FTP server and bring it to your local server. And then there's the put command that you use to put a file from your local server out to the FTP server. Okay, so you know, there's all sorts of other commands in here. You can go through them to check things out. Remember too that if you precede a command by an exclamation mark, that runs it on your local machine. So here, if I say exclamation mark ls, that's going to do a listing of the directory that I'm in on my local machine. Okay, so if I say exclamation mark pwd, that's going to give the working directory of my local machine. Whereas if I type pwd without the exclamation mark, that'll give the working directory of the FTP server that I'm logged into. Okay, so that's a useful command to know, is that exclamation mark. Otherwise, the commands are pretty straightforward, and you can check things out as you want to, you know, as you need to use FTP. Okay, so that's a quick little tour of the basic FTP client. Let's quit out of here, and now let's look at the graphical FTP client that I was telling you about. All right, well, to get into the graphical FTP client, all we do is type gftp, okay, and that'll get us into the graphical FTP client. And then what you do here is you type the host name of the FTP server that you want to get to. So I'm just going to type ftp.redhat.com again. Okay, so, okay, great. So now we're getting that too many connected users, try again later. It says, notice it says waiting 30 seconds until it can connect again. Okay, so what it'll do, if I just sit here and wait, it will try again in 30 seconds. I'm just going to go up here and click the stop button so that I can just go to another website and just show you what's going on here. So what we'll do is we'll go to debian.org. Okay, except you have to spell Debian right. Okay, so you type ftp.debian.org, and now it's trying that particular server. It logged me in as an anonymous user, and now the same sort of thing. Okay, over here is our window at debian.org. Over here is my home directory, home Perry. Okay, so if I want to change my directory over here, I can just pick on a directory and go into that directory by double clicking on it. If I want to pick a directory over here to go into, I can double click on that, and so now I'm in the Debian directory. If I want a particular file, I can just highlight it and then click the arrow, and that's going to bring it this way. Okay, so it's saying successfully transferred Debian README at 1.86 kilobytes per second. Okay, so now if I look down in my list here somewhere, where is it? Keep going. There it is. So there's the README file that I just brought over. Okay, so now that's in my home directory. All right, and I think this is absolutely completely self-explanatory. You know, check out the options if you want to set something else up. But this is basically, I think this is completely self-explanatory how to use the graphical client for FTP. Now let's move along and talk about how to set up an FTP server on your system. All right, let's just start by looking at the package that you're going to need for the VSFTPD. So there's the actual package and the version number that I have installed on this system. Okay, and so that's what you need to set up the actual server. So now once that's installed, you're going to get a few configuration files, and let's look at those configuration files. Let's just open them up with Emacs. So we'll go to Emacs vsftpd.conf, and then we'll open that up here and look at it, and we'll look at it in full screen mode. Okay, so this is the example configuration file for this particular software. Okay, and let's just look at some of the most important options here. Anonymous enable equals yes means that we're allowing anonymous FTP. Okay, local enable is also set equal to yes, which means that we're allowing local users to log in. Okay, so what this means is that if I FTP to this particular server, okay? And then it says, what's your username? Instead of typing anonymous, if I type Perry and then I type my username, it will let me log in as Perry, and then I'll be able to go to my home directory, like grab files from my home directory, put files in my home directory, that sort of thing, okay? This, by enabling this and by saying yes, that you're allowing local users to log in, is a little bit of a security hole, okay? And that's not necessarily so good, all right? Because the reason it's a security hole is because you're allowing users to log in via FTP, and so their username and password are going to travel over the network unencrypted, just in plain text. So if somebody was out there sniffing packets and looking at the network traffic, they could get my username and password and get on the system. Okay. Now, that being said, if they get in as Perry, big deal, right? All they can do is like delete my files. But if I tried to go in as like the root user or something like that, then the root user and the root user's password is traveling over the network unencrypted, and that's a major security hole. Okay, so normally I would say that this should be set to no, unless there was some extenuating circumstances that you needed to have that. There are ways to get into systems remotely. We'll talk about when we get to the security videos, we'll talk about SSH and things like that, where you can allow connections to get into the system, and they'll be secure connections so that the plain text passwords won't be traveling over the internet. Okay, so here we're saying write enables yes means that we're allowed to write things. We're allowed to upload files and make directories and things like that. Okay, if we go down a little bit farther, you'll see here activate directory messages. So what you can do is you can have a file, and I think it's called .message, but we'll see that when we go out to the screen, see how that works. But what you do is, if in a particular directory you want a message to show up on the screen when the users get into that certain directory, you create this file, and like I said, I think it's called .message. Yeah, it is. Okay, I just saw it in my notes. So .message is the file, and then whatever is in that .message file will be displayed to the screen anytime a user goes into that directory that has the .message file. Okay, so you can see here that logging of uploads and downloads is activated. We're using port 20 here. There is the typical place where the transfer log lives. Okay, and you can see stuff here is commented out, so if you want to change that, what you can do is you can uncomment that out by saying like this, and then change, vstpd, special or something .log, okay, something like that. Okay, so you can change the name of that however you want. All right, so I'm just going to put that back to the way it was and comment it back out so it's back to normal. It's using standard log format. Here's some timeouts, things that are set. Again, they're commented out. They're showing you the default value, and if you want to change that, you can uncomment it and then make the timeout whatever you want. Okay, so that's that's the configuration file. There's some other lines in this configuration file that you can look at. They're pretty self-explanatory. There's good comments and so on. There's also a man page or an info page for vsftpd.conf, so you can look at that to see all the different directives that you can put in. Make sure that if you put in a directive into this particular configuration file, you put the name of the directive, like write enable, no spaces, then an equal sign, and then no spaces again, and then the value of the directive. Okay, there can't be any spaces between the name of the directive, the equal sign, and the actual value that you're setting it to. All right, so that's the vsftpd.conf file. Now let's look at another file here that's called vsftpd user list. Okay, so I'm going to pull up this file now, which is also in the Etsy directory, and this file is a list of users that are absolutely positively not allowed to log on to the system. Okay, so even if I had enabled users to log into my system, like I could log in as Perry or something like that, I would not be allowed to log in as any of these particular users. Okay, so if there was a directive in that particular configuration file that said user list underscore deny equals no, then this would actually turn into allowing users in this file. So this would turn into like the users that are allowed to log into my system. So make sure you don't put that directive in that file if you leave this the same, because then like the root user is going to be allowed to log in via FTP. Okay, so that's just another configuration issue there, and this is another file that gets used. Notice here also that there's another configuration file that the PAM config also checks. We don't even know what PAM is yet. We'll talk about that when we get to the security videos and a couple nuggets down the road. All right, well now what we need to do is we need to actually enable the service, okay? So notice here we're in the etc directory in the etc zinetd.d directory. We talked about zinetd back in the introductory videos, and we'll talk more about it at the end of this series in the security videos, but for right now just follow these instructions if you want to get your FTP server up and running, okay? In the zinetd.d directory there's a file in there called vsftpd, okay? So what we'll do is we'll edit that file, vsftpd here, and I'll edit it with the VI editor, okay? And then what we'll do is under where it says disable here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say no, and then instead of yes, okay? So it says disable yes, that means that this FTP service is not running. I'll say disable no so that I can actually run it. So then I say escape, shift : WQ to write my changes and quit, and now if I print out this file, you'll see it says disable no. Okay, so now that I've done that, now all I need to do is to actually restart the zinetd service. Okay, so the way that I can do that is I can say service zinetd, yeah, that's it, zinetd, and then I'll say restart. Okay, and now it will actually, when it restarts the zinetd service, then the FTP service will have been started underneath of that. Okay, so now that the service is up and running, now let's look at how we can use it and also setting permissions and that sort of thing. Okay, so now let's test out and make sure the FTP service is actually running. What we'll do here is we'll just say FTP nugget. Okay, so notice the messages here: ready dude, beat me, break me, whatever. These are, you know, obviously in some configuration file somewhere you can page through and find where you can set these configuration messages. For right now, I'm just going to actually log in and use the system. So I'm going to log in as Perry, remember, because we actually had user logins enabled. Okay, and I'll say, I'll give my password, and now I'm in the system. I'll do pwd, and notice it put me right in my home directory. So if I do a listing there, I can see the files and directories in my home directory, and I can, you know, upload and download as I need to. Okay, so let me just quit out of here. Now let's FTP to Nugget again, but this time I'm just going to log in anonymously. Okay, so FTP, anonymous, and now I'm logged in. Let me do a pwd there. Now it says I'm in the slash directory. I'm in the root directory. I'm not actually in the root directory though. I'm in a directory called var FTP. Okay, so if I look in here, there's bin, etc, lib, and pub. These are all under /var/FTP. But when you go in as an anonymous user, it uses the change root command, and we learned that back, I think it was in the rescue videos. We learned the change root command, and what it's doing is it's saying change the root directory from the regular root directories to /var/FTP. That way the anonymous user can't have access to anything in the file system except the stuff under /var/FTP, and these are the directories under var FTP. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to go back and review the permissions that were set for these directories and just double check to make sure with you that your permissions are set right for these things, so that if somebody does come in as the anonymous user, they're not going to be given some extra permissions that they shouldn't be. Okay, so let's quit out of here, and now let's just review these directory permissions. Alright, so you can see here that we're in the /var/FTP directory. If I do a long listing on this directory, you'll see 4 subdirectories, and these were the same 4 subdirectories we just saw when we logged in as the anonymous user to Nugget, to the FTP server that we're running now on Nugget. Okay, so these were the 4 directories. Just take a look at these permissions here and make sure that your directories are set up with the same permissions. You want to make sure that these things are not that they're not unrestricted, okay, that the users can't come in and start deleting files and things like that. Okay, so you can see the execute permission is set for all of these subdirectories, and that's what's necessary for people to be able to go into those directories and do things and use files, use executable files, or access libraries, or access configuration files in the etc directory, or access the actual files that we want them to download in the pub directory. Okay, if you propagate the pub directory with actual files that you want people to be able to download, make sure sure the permissions on those files are just read, read, read. Okay, they shouldn't have any write permissions for anybody. Notice that the FTP group has access to the pub directory. Okay, and the and otherwise the root is the owner of that directory, and that's why these are writable. Okay, so unless somebody logged in as root, which they're not allowed to because that configuration file disallowed root user logins, then only if you're logged in as root via some other method, like I am right now, and not via FTP, will I be able to write things into these various directories. Okay, so you just have to make sure that the permissions are set up correctly. FTP is a potential source of problems developing because you're letting anonymous users onto your system. So what you need to make sure of is that those anonymous users are not going to have any permissions that they shouldn't have, but remember that they're only going to be able to access this particular part of the file system, because when they logged in as an anonymous user, that change root command happened to make var FTP the actual root of their file system. That's the file system that they see when they log in as the anonymous user. All right, well, in our remaining time, let's just talk a little bit about network news and the software and things that are involved with getting a network news server and client to work on your machine. Okay, so if you've ever perused the news groups, you know there's topics out there on all sorts of stuff. Everything from alt.pets.parrots.breeding to miss.transport.rail.australia and New Zealand. I mean, sometimes when I go through the list of news groups, I'm amazed there's even like 2 subscribers to some of them, because things are just so specific, But that's the beauty of news groups, right, is that on some specific topic, you can open this up to people all over the world, and people that have this common interest can then share ideas about that. And the nice thing about having very specific news groups is when you go on to a news group like transport.rail.australia and New Zealand, you know exactly what kind of information you're going to get. So there's basically 3 types of news servers that you can set up. You can set up a full feed news server, a leaf node news server, or a local news server. Now, a full feed news server means that it receives all of the Usenet news groups from some upstream news server, from some commercial server. Okay, and because it gets all of the news group postings from that commercial server, this full feed news server can then pass that information on to some downstream news server. It can act as a full feed news server for some other downstream news server. Okay, a leaf node news server, on the other hand, is only going to receive the information from the upstream news server that it wants. Okay, because it's sort of like, if you think of it as a tree, there's some sort of general master news server out here, and then we pass on the information, and then when you get down to a leaf like this one here, well, that news server isn't passing it on to anyone else, so it doesn't have to download all of the postings from all of the different news groups on the internet, because no one's relying on it for any postings. Okay, so that's a leaf node news server. Okay, a local news server, on the other hand, is just going to provide news a news feed for a local organization. So for a particular company or something, maybe you want to start a news group that talks about issues within the company, how you can better manage things, or how this project is going, or whatever. Okay, but that local news you don't want that to be read by anybody in the outside world anyway. So you set up a local news server that's disjoint from this whole tree of Usenet stuff, and then maybe within your organization, there's a couple levels of news servers and leaf nodes and so on, but that's completely disjoint from the Usenet news server tree that we think of typically. Okay, now there's lots and lots of clients out there to read news. XChat is one of the popular ones. SLRN, there's a Mozilla news client. Okay, so pick and choose whatever one you want. They're all basically the same. They all have a slightly different look and feel to them, but pick through whichever client you want to use. What I want to do now is just go out to the Linux screen, talk a little bit about the software you need to set up a news server, and show you some of the configuration files that are associated with that software. Well, the package that comes with Red Hat Linux for a news server is called INN. It just stands for Internet News. Okay, the daemon that actually runs the news server is called INND. Okay, you can see here that I'm in the Etsy news directory, and that's where all of the configuration files live for INN. And the main configuration file is right here, and it's called inn.conf. Now there is a man page for inn.conf, and we can look at that, and this has information about all the various parameters you can set and what they accomplish and so on. So you should go through this if you're trying to set up a news server on your local system to see what kinds of parameters you need to change to get the news server running on your system. Okay, if what you're doing though is setting up a local news server or a leaf node news server for some small domain that's not going to see a lot of traffic, then a better alternative might be this other news server called leaf node. Okay, I searched for this in Google and you can see I got a bunch of hits. I read this article a while back at the Linux Gazette talking about how easy it was to set up leaf node. You can see there's some other sites here. There's an RPM here for the leaf node program and so on. Okay, so if what you're doing is setting up a leaf node or a local news server for a small site that's not going to see a lot of traffic, this might be the way to go, especially if you've tried INN and you found it difficult to deal with all the different configuration files and so on. This one seems much easier to set up than INN is. Alright, well, it's time to wrap up our nugget on FTP and network news. We started by talking about some FTP clients. We looked at the text-based FTP program, and we also looked at the graphical FTP program called GNOME FTP. And this one I didn't even talk that much about because I thought the user interface was so intuitive that it's just easy to use right from the time that you open it up the first time. Okay. That being said, I think it's still valuable to learn the commands and be familiar with the text-based FTP program because it is so ubiquitous and some version of this program is on practically every computer in the world that's out there. Okay. We talked about FTP servers. We set up a VS-FTPD server on our local Nugget machine and we used that. This server, even though it's called the very secure FTPD server, is really not all that secure because still ultimately it's just FTP and there's no encryption of passwords or anything going on. So you still need to be careful about how you set it up and how you allow access so that this doesn't become some sort of security hole. And we'll talk more about alternatives to this and things like that in the security nuggets that are coming up at the end of this series. And finally, we just talked briefly about internet news. We talked about two of the programs that are out there, INN and LeafNode. And INN is like the full-service internet news program that comes with Red Hat Linux. But if you just need a small local server for your particular domain that's not going to see a lot of traffic, probably LeafNode is a better alternative because it's so much easier to set up. Well, I hope you found this nugget informative. Thanks again for watching.